History is full of gaps. Records are lost, left incomplete, or written by those with swords in hand and gold on their minds. But somewhere in these murky waters, two battles emerged laying claim to the title of the first naval battle of the New World. The first in 1499, led by Alonso de Ojeda, a man whose name should echo alongside Columbus. But while Columbus built the system of conquest, Ojeda was its blade. His name became synonymous with terror, raiding villages, mutilating captives, and carving his legacy into the Caribbean frontier with blood. And the second, decades later, off the coast of Cubagua, where Spanish forces clinging to their fragile Pearl Empire fought off a French pirate raid with the help of indigenous warriors. While one was a sudden skirmish and the other a desperate naval defense, both marked the beginning of European warfare at sea in the Americas. Today, we unravel these forgotten clashes, where cannon fire and arrows first darkened the waters of the Caribbean and the fight for the riches of the New World began. It is the late 15th century. Spain has only just begun its hold over the newly discovered lands of the Americas. Christopher Columbus's voyages have opened the floodgates, revealing a world brimming with untapped riches. Gold, silver, pearls, resources that would fuel the ambitions of European empires for centuries to come. While Spain pretended to claim vast territories through papal decree and the Treaty of Tordesillas, which divided the New World with Portugal, the reality was far messier. The Caribbean, instead of being a quiet Spanish domain, became a lawless frontier where European powers circled like hungry, vicious sharks. Portugal had its own ambitions. The French sent privateers to plunder Spanish settlements, and soon the English would follow suit. Needless to say, Spain's hold over its New World territories was fragile. These were not yet sprawling colonies with established defenses, but precarious footholds. Small towns and outposts clinging to the coastline depended on supplies from across the Atlantic. The Spanish were stretched thin, struggling to defend their claims against relentless attacks. And it was in this volatile world that the first naval battles of the New World erupted, marking the beginning of a long, bloody fight for control over the Americas. The year is 1499. Spain is still in the early days of solidifying its dominance over the New World, and the shores of South America remain largely unexplored. The Spanish crown has begun granting licenses for expeditions outside of Columbus's control, eager to expand its reach and claim untold riches before rival European powers can stake their own claims. Enter Alonso de Ojeda, a name that should be far more infamous than it is today. Bold, cunning, and utterly ruthless, he was a soldier turned explorer, having fought in Spain's final wars against the Moors before setting his sights on conquest across the Atlantic. He had sailed with Columbus on his second voyage, but now he sought his own path and his own fortune. Beckoned by powerful merchants in Spain and accompanied by none other than Americo Vespucci, Ojeda set sail with a small fleet of 4 ships. His mission was one of exploration, but more than that, it was about asserting Spanish dominance over uncharted waters. His fleet traced the northern coast of South America, mapping territory, making contact with indigenous peoples, and more often than not, taking captives to be sold into slavery. Somewhere in the Gulf of Paria, off the coast of modern-day Venezuela, Ojeda's fleet encountered another force. Historical accounts are unclear. Were these Portuguese sailors encroaching on Spain's new domain, or were they privateers, early raiders looking to loot whatever ships they encountered? What is certain is that battle erupted. The engagement was brutal and swift. Cannons thundered across the sea, filling the air with thick clouds of smoke. Wooden hulls splintered as ships collided, and steel clashed as men fought desperately on the decks of battered vessels. This was not a grand naval engagement of fleets maneuvering information. It was a vicious melee, an early glimpse of the lawlessness that would soon define the Caribbean waters. In the end, Ojeda emerged victorious. His fleet continued south, and his actions laid the groundwork for future Spanish incursions into the region. This small but crucial engagement marked the dawn of European naval warfare in the New World. Spain's dominion was not unquestioned, and conflict at sea would soon become a defining aspect of its colonial rule. The years passed and Spain's hold on the Caribbean remained tenuous. By the early 16th century, the Spanish had begun to extract great wealth from the region, none more lucrative than the pearl fisheries of Cubagua, a small, barren island off the coast of what is now Venezuela. This tiny, sun-scorched piece of land, inhospitable and dry, became the center of a thriving pearl trade that funneled unimaginable wealth back to Spain. But where there was wealth, there was danger. The French had taken notice. The Caribbean was supposed to be Spain's domain, but European rivals were increasingly unwilling to respect the Treaty of Tordesillas. Privateers, many of them acting with unofficial support from their governments, began preying on Spanish settlements and shipping lanes. and now their gaze had turned to Cubagua. But Cubagua was not defended by Spain alone. The island's wealth, the pearls pulled from the seabed, were drawn from the hands and lungs of indigenous divers, forced to descend into the depths day after day. Among the indigenous people tied to the Cubagua were the Waikerí, who had long navigated and fished in these waters. The Waikerí were the principal inhabitants of Margarita Island and the nearby coasts, and they maintained a seasonal presence on Cubagua before the Spanish transformed it into a permanent extraction site. The relationship with the Spanish was complex. Over time, many Waikerí were integrated into the colonial economy as vassals, their labor and knowledge of the seas becoming indispensable to Spanish success. When the French arrived, and the Waikerí who fought alongside the Spanish, when the sails of the French fleet darkened the horizon, the Spanish garrison and their indigenous allies braced for a siege. The Waikerí, with their intimate knowledge of the sea, took to their canoes. These were not fragile crafts, they were extensions of their bodies, sleek, swift, cutting through the shallows while the Europeans struggled in deeper waters. They knew every current, every sandbar. They had fished these waters before Spain ever dreamed of pearls. They harassed the French ships, firing arrows from the water's edge, their silhouettes barely visible against the waves. Some accounts of Caribbean battles speak of flaming arrows streaking across the night sky. Perhaps it happened here too, though we cannot know for certain. The chaos of these battles is often lost to time, but we can imagine the Waikerí maneuvering between cannon blasts and musket fire, knowing that retreat was not an option. For the Waikerí, this was not a matter of defending a Spanish island, it was defending their position within a landscape they had known for generations. The pearls may have been plundered for the crown, but they had been gathered by indigenous hands long before Spanish ships arrived. Defending Cubagua meant defending their place within an altered world, where their survival was now entangled with the empire that had forced itself upon their shores. The battle raged on both land and sea. Spanish artillery fired from the coast, muskets cracked from the decks of galleons. The French, expecting an easy raid, found themselves trapped between Spanish steel and indigenous precision. They had underestimated both their enemies' firepower and their allies' mastery of these waters. Finally battered and bloody, the French withdrew. Some fled towards Santo Domingo, seeking easier plunder. Others limped back to their ports, carrying stories of an island where pearls were defended not just by Spaniards, but by canoes and arrows, by men who knew the currents better than any ship ever could. Spain had won, Cubagua was saved. But what did that victory mean for the Waikerí? There were no rewards for their bravery, no titles granted by the crown. They returned to the sea, as they always had, diving for pearls not for their wealth, but for their survival. The Spanish yoke was not loosened. If anything, the island's value now meant tighter control, harsher demands. Perhaps on the evening after the battle, a few Waikerí warriors paddled their canoes back into the shallows, not to fight, but to fish. Perhaps they looked toward the horizon and saw the fading silhouette of the French fleet, knowing that the sea would bring others. For the Waikerí and for Cubagua, the struggle was far from over. The New World had become a contested battleground, and this battle was a foreshadowing of the centuries of naval warfare to come. In the decades following, Spain would invest heavily in fortifying key ports, organizing naval convoys, and expanding its naval presence. But the lesson had been learned. The Caribbean could no longer be taken for granted. The first naval battles of the New World were not just conflicts between ships, they were a signal that the era of uncontested Spanish rule was over. From then on, the Caribbean would not belong to a single empire, but to the constant violent struggles of nations, privateers, and pirates, each vying for their piece of the New World's riches.